There is a steak in the meat case that most people walk past without giving it a second look. It does not have the biggest price tag. It does not have a giant bone sticking out of it. It does not come with a name that makes people stop and take a picture. But if I were choosing dinner with my own money, I would pay attention to that steak before I reached for the expensive ones. That is because the best value in a meat case is rarely determined by the biggest letters on the label. It comes down to something much simpler. You have to know what the muscle is doing. I spent years watching people shop for beef by name. They came in looking for ribeye, strip steak, filet, or porterhouse. They already knew what they wanted before they opened the refrigerator door, and I understood why. Those are familiar names. The problem is that a familiar name does not tell you everything about the piece of meat sitting in front of you. Two steaks can carry the same label and eat very differently. Two pieces can cost the same and have completely different amounts of marbling. And sometimes a cheaper cut is sitting only inches away from a more expensive one, waiting for somebody who knows what they are looking at. That is the part I want to teach you. Not how to memorize every cut on a cow. How to look at beef the way a butcher looks at it. The first thing I want you to understand is that tenderness and flavor are not the same thing. People often treat them as if they are identical. They are not. Some of the softest muscles on an animal do very little work. That helps explain why they can be extremely tender. But muscles that work harder can develop a deeper, stronger beef character. That gives you a choice. You can spend your money chasing softness, or you can learn how to find flavor and then prepare the meat correctly. That second option is where the bargains start appearing. One of the first cuts I would look for is the chuck eye. It comes from the shoulder area close to the rib section, and the muscle has a strong connection to the ribeye area. When you find a good one with attractive marbling, it deserves your attention. You are not getting a magical imitation of a premium steak. You are getting a piece of beef with its own strengths, and when selected and cooked properly, those strengths can make it an excellent value. The Denver is another one worth knowing. It comes from the shoulder and can have substantial marbling. It is not nearly as famous as the cuts people usually put in the center of the display. That is exactly why I like knowing about it. When shoppers are all fighting over the same 5 names, unfamiliar cuts often have room to offer better value. But there is a catch. You have to understand the grain. A steak with long muscle fibers needs to be sliced properly after cooking. This is where people can spend good money and still end up disappointed. They cook the meat correctly. They season it correctly. They let it rest. Then they cut it in the same direction as the fibers. Now every bite contains long strands of muscle. The steak gets blamed. The knife was the problem. Look closely at the raw steak before you cook it. Find the direction of the fibers, then remember it. If you are working with a cut where the grain is difficult to identify later, make a tiny notch on one edge before cooking. Just a small mark. That gives you a reference point after the crust darkens. When the steak is finished, use that mark to remember the direction the grain was traveling, then slice across it, not along it. And with strongly fibrous cuts, thinner slices usually make the meat easier to chew because you are shortening the muscle fibers before they reach your teeth. That is one of the cheapest tricks you will ever learn. It costs nothing. Now let me tell you about a cut that can hide even more value: chuck roast. Most people see a chuck roast and immediately think pot roast, and for good reason. It is excellent for slow cooking, but a whole chuck roast is not always one uniform piece of muscle. There can be several muscles inside it, separated by natural seams. If you know where those seams are, you can sometimes separate the roast into different portions instead of treating the entire thing as one block. This is one of those skills that becomes much easier once you stop fighting the meat. Do not start hacking randomly with a knife. Look for the natural separation. Use your fingers. Pull gently. When two muscles begin to separate, follow that line with your knife. You are not forcing the meat apart. You are following the structure that is already there. That can reveal pieces that are better suited to different cooking methods. Some can be used for slow cooking. Some sections, depending on their exact structure and marbling, can work well as steaks, and the trim does not have to become waste. It can go toward ground beef. That is how a butcher thinks about a larger piece, not as one label, as several opportunities. Now, there is another steak I want you to learn to identify: skirt steak. But be careful here, because the word alone is not enough. There are different skirt sections, and they do not necessarily give you the same eating experience. If you have a choice, pay attention to thickness, marbling, and structure. A thicker, well-marbled piece with a strong but manageable grain can be a beautiful steak when handled properly. And there is one rule you absolutely cannot ignore: cut across the grain. Skirt steak has long fibers. That is part of why it has so much beef flavor. It is also why careless slicing can make it feel chewy. Cook it quickly over strong heat, let it settle briefly, and then slice it thinly across the fibers. Do not carve it into thick chunks. That defeats the whole purpose. Another cut that deserves attention is hanger steak. It has a distinctive beef flavor and comes from an area that does not get the same kind of attention as the premium loin cuts, but it needs proper trimming. There is connective tissue that you do not want to chew through, so separate the usable sections and remove the tough center before cooking. Then keep the preparation simple: salt, heat, a good sear, and a proper slice. You do not need to bury every flavorful steak in a complicated marinade. In fact, that can sometimes hide what makes the beef interesting in the first place. Now, let us move to the other side of the meat case: filet. There is nothing wrong with filet. It is tender. It is elegant. It is easy to understand why people like it. But you should know what you are paying for. You are paying heavily for tenderness. If tenderness is exactly what you want, that may be worth it. But if your priority is deep beef flavor, you have other options. This is why I do not like calling one steak the best. Best for what? Best for tenderness? Best for flavor? Best for tenderness? Best for flavor? Best for grilling? Best for a quick dinner? Best for feeding 6 people? Those are different questions. A steak should be judged according to what you want it to do. That brings us to the T-bone and porterhouse. They look impressive because they give you 2 different muscles on one plate. One side is strip loin, the other is tenderloin. That sounds like the perfect combination until you think about how those muscles cook. The tenderloin is leaner. The strip contains more fat. They do not necessarily want exactly the same amount of heat or time, so you are cooking 2 different pieces of meat attached to the same bone. That does not make the steak bad. It simply means there is a compromise involved, and the difference between a porterhouse and a T-bone is not that one came from a better animal. The distinction is primarily related to the size of the tenderloin section. That means you should not automatically assume the more impressive word on the label guarantees a dramatically better eating experience. Now look at New York strip. This is another place where I want you to stop buying the name and start examining the actual piece. A strip loin can have sections with different muscle structure. One portion may look beautifully even with attractive marbling and a clean grain. Another section can contain a thicker seam and coarser fibers. Same general cut, different piece. That is why I would rather compare 3 steaks with my own eyes than trust one word printed on a package. Look at the marbling. Fine streaks distributed through the muscle are what I want to see. I am not looking for enormous chunks of external fat. I want the fat inside the muscle. That is where it can melt during cooking and contribute to the eating experience. And do not make the mistake of thinking the reddest steak is automatically the best steak. Color changes with oxygen exposure. Surface oxidation can make beef look darker. That alone does not tell you that the meat is spoiled. Look at the whole picture. Does it have a clean smell? Does the surface feel firm rather than slimy? Does the meat look healthy underneath the surface? Use those clues together. Do not let one visual detail make the entire decision. There is another shopping habit I recommend. Do not automatically grab the first package in the row. Compare the pieces. Look beyond the front. If the display has several steaks with the same name and price, choose based on the actual meat. The label is not going to tell you which individual steak has the best marbling. You have to look. And when the display seems picked over, ask the butcher what is in the back. Sometimes there are larger pieces waiting to be cut. Sometimes there are portions that have not been displayed yet. Most shoppers never ask. That is why they never know. Now, before you buy anything, ask yourself how you are going to cook it. This sounds obvious. It is not. A lean working muscle and a heavily marbled steak should not automatically receive the same treatment. A thin steak can take high heat and finish quickly. A thick steak needs more control because the outside can become dark long before the center reaches the temperature you want. A tough cut with substantial connective tissue may be better suited to slow cooking. A lean cut may need a completely different strategy. The meat is giving you instructions. You just have to read them. And this is where one of the biggest home cooking mistakes happens. People think a marinade can fix anything. It cannot. A marinade can season the outside and influence the outer portion of the meat, but it does not magically transform a heavily worked muscle into tenderloin. If the internal structure is tough, the marinade does not erase that structure. That is why I would never tell you to buy a cheap lean steak and assume a bottle of marinade will solve every problem. Choose the right method first. Then use seasoning to support the meat instead of trying to hide it. If you have a lean round steak, for example, think carefully before putting it over a screaming hot grill and cooking it until well done. That is a recipe for disappointment. The better approach may be to treat it as a roast or use a preparation where the muscle has a chance to become more pleasant to eat. And when you do cook a lean steak quickly, be especially careful not to push it past the point you actually want. There is very little internal fat to protect you from overcooking. That is the trade-off. Now we can talk about the most important thing you can do once you get the steak home. Dry the surface. Before the steak touches the pan, take paper towels and remove the excess moisture. Press the surface. Turn the steak, dry the other side. If the surface is wet, the pan has to spend energy evaporating that water before it can brown the meat properly. You want the heat working on the steak, not boiling moisture off its surface. That dry surface is the beginning of a good crust. And there is another detail people underestimate. Do not crowd the pan. If you put too much cold meat into a small skillet, the temperature drops and moisture collects. Instead of getting strong browning, you can end up steaming the meat. Give the steaks room. If necessary, cook in batches. It takes a little longer, but it protects the result. Now we are getting close to the part that separates a good piece of beef from a great dinner. Heat. You want the pan hot enough to brown the surface efficiently, but you do not want to burn the exterior while the center is still cold. That becomes especially important with thick steaks. For those, a gentler first stage followed by a very hot finishing sear can give you more control. You are solving two different problems separately. Warm the center gradually, then build the crust quickly. That is much easier than forcing one extreme temperature to do both jobs at once. And do not keep flipping, pressing, and moving the steak every few seconds. Give the surface time to make contact with the pan. Let the browning happen. You can check it when enough time has passed, but you do not need to disturb it constantly. A steak is not going to cook better because you stared at it for 5 minutes. It cooks better because you controlled the heat. The same principle applies to temperature. A clock can give you a rough idea. It cannot see the thickness of your steak. It cannot see how cold the meat was. It cannot know exactly how hot your pan became. That is why a thermometer can be useful. Measure the thickest part of the steak. Do not press the probe against the pan or directly into a bone. You want to know what is happening in the meat itself. And remember that cooking does not stop the second the steak leaves the heat. The internal temperature can continue to rise while it rests. That is why experienced cooks pay attention to where they remove the steak, not just where they want it to finish. There is no magic number that makes every steak identical. Thickness, fat, cooking method, and starting temperature all matter. But the principle is simple. Control the heat, watch the center, And do not cook farther than necessary. Then let the steak rest briefly before slicing. Do not destroy the crust by wrapping the meat tightly and trapping a cloud of steam around it. You work to create that surface, keep it intact, and when the knife finally goes in, remember the lesson from the beginning, find the grain, cut across it. That may be the single most overlooked step in cooking cheaper beef. You can spend more money, or you can become better with the knife. The second option is a lot cheaper, and there is still one piece of this puzzle that most shoppers never learn. Some of the biggest bargains in the entire meat department are hiding in cuts people think are only meant for roasts. If you know how to separate those muscles, recognize the useful sections, and match each one to the right cooking method, you can make one purchase do the work of several different meals. That is where the real butcher knowledge starts. And in the second part, I will show you exactly how to judge those overlooked pieces, which labels deserve your attention, which ones can be misleading, and how to build a simple buying system that helps you choose better beef without automatically reaching for the highest price. Now that you know how to look at the steak itself, there is one final skill that can completely change the way you shop for beef. You have to stop thinking of the meat counter as a collection of steak names. Think of it as a collection of muscles. Every muscle has a job. Some muscles barely work, some work constantly. Some contain heavy marbling, some are naturally lean. Some have connective tissue that needs time to break down. And some are perfectly good for a hot grill but become unpleasant the moment you cook them too far. Once you understand that, the price tag becomes much less intimidating because you start seeing value where other shoppers see nothing special. Take the shoulder again. A lot of people see a chuck roast and immediately place it in the slow cooking category. And most of the time that is exactly what they should do. But if you are buying a larger piece, look closely at how the muscles are arranged. You may notice natural seams separating different sections. Those seams are not random. They are telling you where one muscle ends and another begins. If you follow them carefully, you can separate the roast into useful pieces. This is one of the simplest ways to get more value from a larger purchase. Instead of buying several individually packaged pieces, you buy one larger cut and decide what each section is best suited for. One portion can go into a slow cooker. Another can become a quick meal. The smaller pieces can become stew meat, and the trim can be ground. You are not wasting anything simply because the label says roast. You are looking at what is actually inside. That is the difference between shopping like a consumer and shopping like someone who understands meat. But there is another important rule. Do not buy a large cut simply because you think buying in bulk is automatically cheaper. Calculate the usable meat. If you are paying for a huge amount of external fat, heavy connective tissue, or bone, the price per pound on the package does not tell the entire story. A smaller cut with less waste can sometimes be the better deal. This is why experienced shoppers compare more than the sticker. They look at what they are actually going to eat, and that brings us to grades. You will see terms such as prime, choice, and select. Those grades can be useful, but they should not replace your eyes. A higher grade generally indicates more marbling at the carcass level, but individual pieces can still vary. If you have two steaks sitting next to each other with the same grade, one may have a much more attractive distribution of fat. That is the one I want. I am not buying the word prime. I am buying the piece of meat. This is a subtle distinction, but it matters. People often assume that a higher grade automatically means every steak from that grade will be better than every steak below it. That is too simplistic. Your job at the counter is to evaluate the actual piece. Look for fine, evenly distributed marbling. Look for a good shape. Look for a thickness that matches the cooking method you plan to use. And avoid paying extra simply because a label sounds impressive. The same idea applies to the word aged. Aged beef can be excellent, but the word itself is not enough information. Ask what kind of aging was used. Ask how long. Dry aging and wet aging are not identical processes. Dry aging changes the flavor and texture in a very particular way. It also involves moisture loss and trimming, which can make properly dry-aged beef more expensive. Wet-aged beef is different. The meat ages in a sealed environment, and the flavor profile is generally less concentrated than traditional dry aging. So if a package is asking you to pay a premium because it says aged, know what you are actually getting. Do not pay for a buzzword, pay for the product. Now let's talk about something else that can fool shoppers: the markdown sticker. A reduced price steak is not automatically a bad steak. Sometimes a store marks down meat because it is approaching the end of its preferred display period. That does not mean you should ignore basic food safety rules. You still need to inspect the package, follow the use-by guidance, keep the meat cold, and cook or freeze it appropriately. But a darker surface alone is not enough reason to reject beef. Oxygen exposure changes appearance. What matters is the overall condition. If the package is leaking, swollen, damaged, or the meat has an abnormal odor or slimy texture, walk away. No bargain is worth ignoring those warning signs. But if the meat is properly packaged and looks sound, a markdown can sometimes be a useful opportunity. That is where having a plan helps. If you know you are cooking steak that night, you can choose something based on quality rather than simply picking the prettiest package. And sometimes the best person to ask is the butcher. Do not be afraid to ask direct questions. What came in today? Which piece has the best marbling? Do you have a whole loin you are cutting from? Is there a shoulder cut you would recommend for grilling? Those questions can reveal options that never make it into the main display. And if the butcher tells you a cut is better for braising, listen. The goal is not to prove that every piece can become a steak. The goal is to choose meat that matches what you are trying to cook. That is an important distinction. Sometimes the best bargain is not a bargain steak. It is a cut that becomes extraordinary when cooked slowly. Short ribs are a good example. They contain plenty of connective tissue and fat. That structure is exactly what makes them unsuitable for a quick, careless cooking method. But give them time. Use controlled heat. Let the connective tissue soften. Now you have something rich and deeply satisfying. You did not make a cheap cut behave like filet. You allowed it to become the kind of food it was naturally designed to become. That is the philosophy I want you to take away. Do not fight the muscle. Work with it. The same thing applies to brisket. Brisket is not a steak you throw on a pan for 5 minutes and expect to be tender. It is a heavily worked muscle. It contains substantial connective tissue. Low and slow is what transforms it. The magic is not in the price. It is in the cooking method. And once you realize that, you start seeing a pattern. Cheap meat often becomes expensive tasting food when you give it the right amount of time. Expensive meat often becomes disappointing food when you cook it without understanding what is happening. That is why I would rather teach you technique than give you a list of expensive cuts, because a list can tell you what to buy. Technique tells you what to do after you